Vittorio, thanks for talking to us today. We appreciate it so much, we know.
It's a pleasure, and I apologize for not being able to be fully embodied in person in Chicago, which I trust will be a very interesting venue for discussion about the topics we are about to discuss today.
Well, thanks again. This symposium is about experiencing the built environment, and human perception is so fundamental to that. It's so obvious.
Yeah.
Yet your work has changed very much how we think normally about human perception. And your work with mirror neurons has led to this model that you have developed, your perceptual model of embodied simulation. Can you tell us about your work?
Yes, let's say that the discovery of mirror neurons was the pinnacle of a line of research which made quite interesting discovery before the actual discovery of mirror neurons. Basically, to squeeze it in a nutshell, what we revealed is that we don't see uniquely by using the so-called visual part of our brain, but vision is intrinsically, even at the level, not just metaphorically, but at the level of the brain, a multimodal enterprise. So, for example, when I look at a given object sitting on this table, say my mobile phone, as soon as I look to mobile phone, even if I do not have any intention to grab it, my motor system is responding to the object in a very similar way as when I am about to stretch out my arm and grab the very same object. This motor neuron that we designated as canonical neuron basically translate the three-dimensional shape of the object into the most suitable motor program required to interact with that object, even when we do not have any motor plan with that object, which entails that as soon as I look to that object manifests to me not just as a three-dimensional icon, but as the potential target of my pragmatic intentional relationship. So when I look at this object, my motor brain bodily simulate what I could potentially do with that object. Even more interesting for architecture is the way our brain maps space, particularly space in the vicinity of our body. Research being done in Parma, led by Giacomo Rizzolatti at the beginning of the 80s of last century, revealed that the brain of primates, including humans, map space in a variety of ways. One specific way to map space is to carve out two different regions in space. The first, what we designate as peripersonal space, is the space of our pragmatic interaction with the world, namely the space that can be reached by stretching out our arm. Whatever lies beyond that reachable point in space is designated as extrapersonal space. Peripersonal space is mapped by the motor system. We discover neurons that guide our reaching and orienting movement in three-dimensional space, but the very same neuron also respond to tactile stimuli applied to the very same body part, the movement of which they are in control of, respond to visual stimuli moving around the very same body part, or to events that produce sounds in the very same portion of space which surrounds the body part that this motor neuron control motorically. So this visual receptive field is not anchored to where I direct my gaze, is not related to the position of my eyes, and therefore is not retinocentric. This visual receptive field is body-centered. It moves along with the body part. As long as I move it, the visual receptive field moves along. So, and finally, we discover mirror neurons that control our goal-directed motor acts, grasping, holding, placing, or communicative actions. It controls the execution of these motor acts, but at the same time, the very same neurons respond when we are the witnesses, the beholder of the very same motor actions being performed by others we interact with. So, embodied simulation, the hypothesis, the model of embodied simulation was an attempt to provide a coherent theoretical framework that could explain all this variety of phenomena that share one common property. A part of our brain simulate what we would do with objects in space in relation to others. And this simulation is an integral part of our perception of objects of space and of others. By means of embodied simulation, in other words, we have a much more direct access to the world of objects, to the physical space in which our behavior takes place, our interactions with others and with the world of physical object takes place, and our interaction of others. So that's why I don't like to link uniquely or exclusively the notion of embodied simulation with the notion of mirroring, of the mechanism of mirror neurons, because embodied simulation exceeds the functional properties of mirror neurons, because as I tried to explain a minute ago, it applies also to our perception of three-dimensional objects, it applies to our perception of space. And for all of these reasons, this new model of perception, I think, has something to say in relation to the making and our perception of architecture, of architectural spaces.
So that's a vast change from considering the common way to consider architecture as a primarily visual art, judged by its visual qualities and symbols.
Yeah, I think that architecture makes no exception. In the very same way, when we behold an artwork, say a painting, a fresco, or a three-dimensional sculpture, we engage with those artworks not just with our visual system, but putting in play the motor system, as I explained, the tactile system. This is something we haven't talked yet, but we were the first to demonstrate that the notion of touch, the notion of contact, even when metaphorically employed, for example, I can say that the bottom of this mobile phone is in contact with the surface of this table. When I see this object touching the other object, my tactile part of my brain kicks in, is activated, even if I do not attribute any tactile sensation neither to the surface of the table nor to the mobile phone which rests upon it. The just very notion of contact is mapped on our own somatosensory system. So the idea is that whenever I behold something which is the expression of human creativity, be it a painting, a sculpture, a movie, or an architectonical space, I engage in this perception a lot more than my visual system. Basically, I engage my emotional system, my tactile system, my motor system. So we are synesthetes, not just metaphorically when we read Mallarmé, but we are synesthete 24 hours a day. Our perception is intrinsically synesthetic.
So, as architects, we should be paying attention to tactile qualities.
Definitely.
To all of the senses, because we're synesthetic, all of us. But also, embodied simulation is so much about the imagination. We're imagining our next
Exactly. The relationship between embodied simulation and imagination is also very important, and particularly so when we address topics related to aesthetic experience. For a long time, we have done our best to draw a very defined and sharp line between reality and the imaginary world. The imaginary world has been for ages considered as something other than the world of reality. Cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience have changed dramatically this point of view. Why? Because it has been shown that doing something is much more similar to imagining doing the same thing than what previously thought. For example, if I imagine to carry a bag full of bottle of mineral water up to the fourth floor, step by step, at the end of this imaginary exercise, my blood pressure will turn out to be increased, my heart rate will increase, my breathing rate will increase. So, in a word, my bodily condition is incredibly similar to my bodily condition when I don't imagine, but I actually carry those bottles of water on the fourth floor, going up the staircase. And similarly, and here the work of Koslin has been highly influential, seeing and imagining seeing share a great deal of neural resources. So a great many of the brain areas that are involved when doing something or looking at something are also involved when we simply close our eyes and imagine to do something or imagine to see something. So imagination, creativity, memory are all intertwined, very tightly interlinked, and embodied simulation is a key element showing all these links from a functional point of view, from the point of view of the brain-body system.
So, using your example of carrying the water bottles,
Yes.
which were just delivered by somebody else, so
Right.
lower blood pressure. But as a person experiencing architecture, the steps, the level of the steps going up to an entrance, we're going to judge that based on our experience of going up other steps according to their height. All of these would all this be stored in our body memory?
Yes, all this is stored in our procedural memories, which are a huge part of the so-called cognitive or non-repressed unconscious. There are some studies which at first sight might be very far away. This is an extreme case showing you how closely linked is our body knowledge. Our implicit body memories are relevant to affect the way we perceive the so-called external world. I mean, perception is relational, and relation, I think, is a key word, is a real catchword to explain the way we function in the world. Most of what we are doing is in relation to something else or to somebody else. Be it a building or a person or an object. So this relational quality calls very vehemently, underline very clearly the fundamental pragmatic nature of this relation that we establish with the world. Therefore, the crucial importance of our motor behavior, even in aspects of our behavior that we would not at first sight assign as a function of the motor part of our brain, namely vision. So these things have been said many times in the past, and I think Harry Malgrave and other of his colleagues have been crucial in revealing and the importance of this historical debate in aesthetics and in architecture, emphasizing the relation between our perception of architectonical space, of buildings, and our very bodily nature. And the first name that comes to mind is, of course, Wölfflin, where in his doctoral dissertation he makes the claim, if we were just purely visual creature, we would be deprived of the possibility to appreciate fully architectonic space, because this stems directly from our bodily nature, from our being subject to the force of gravity and the like. So the elevation that I may perceive when I enter a Gothic cathedral is not metaphorical, is not a post hoc explanation that I cognitively produce, but is the genuine outcome of this bodily perception that those architects knew very well, and they were able to exploit to such a high degree in creating what they did.
The process of making architecture is abstract. We listen to our clients, we digest the program, we have so many complex variables to consider, but it's all somehow removed from us necessarily because we have to go above and down at our drawing.
Yeah.
And so even in the education of the architect, we learn about theory and history, very little about making, very little about tactile things. The nature of architectural education is quite visual in and of itself. And so it seems like we've gone to the opposite pole away from the cathedral that you just mentioned.
Yeah.
And so, since so much of our experience of architecture relies on bodily experiences that we already have in our, let's say, unconscious, cognitive unconscious.
Right.
How could we differently approach our work, given how important the body is? Because we talk about the body embodiment, yes, we should be thinking of the body, but actually the bodily experiences that make us immediately love a space or be repulsed by it.
The aesthetic evaluation of a given architectonical space is just one element of a series of elements that make a place to live, to work, to entertain, to be educated, to kill time waiting for the next train and or the next plane and the like, much more complex than the simple aesthetic parameters a priori defined by the contemporary taste. I think it's much more complex because it will contain people and these people will bring along their idiosyncrasies, their preferences, their life histories, their own implicit memories, their way to navigate space, their way to interact with objects, to move around. All these elements must be constitutive part of the creation, of the design of architectonical space. For the reason that we were saying yesterday, I've been always fascinated by the idea, the hypothesis, probably very difficult to prove, that many of the styles, architectonical details that shape the history of architecture, particularly in classic time in Greece, were somehow inspired or derived from the observation of nature. Not the mere aesthetic contemplation of nature, but what nature in the daily practice of relation and interaction was suggesting to human. And in that respect, this summer I was reading this beautiful book written by the Russian poet Osip Mandelstam. He travels in the 30s in Armenia, and is in this book, Journey to Armenia, he writes that he first sensed the rudiments of architecture from pine cones, and the demon of architecture had thereafter accompanied him all of his life. So this clear perception that the nature where we live may inspire the homemade environment that architecture enable to build. The two are tightly coupled. So we can have trees growing on buildings. They are very popular now. They may appeal to our aesthetic sense, but I think we can do much better, both from an urbanistic point of view, down to the level to the way we design interiors, the way we choose materials. Their tactile quality are very important. And indeed, we are actively exploring the tactile component of our vision of a variety of images. Particularly, we are interested in exploring the relation between touch and digital images. This is a very little explored field of investigation, which nevertheless has a lot of literature in the past. So we are discovering that both at the factual but also at the metaphorical level, whenever touch contact comes into play, the tactile brain kicks in. So if I read a sentence like a rough task, my somatosensory cortex is activated. It has been shown a few years ago with an fMRI experiment. So even more so with language is not at stake, but what is at stake is my perception, my navigation of the environment surrounding me where I'm supposed to live my life.
Well, so what would be the consequence if everything were smooth? I mean, much architecture of recent decades has not been sufficiently conscious of the importance of touch, the visual importance of touch also, that they're not, they're degrees of something that's totally united. But let's say the world, what is the difference between in America, your time spent at Berkeley, many interiors are sheetrock, smooth, gypsum board. In Italy, there's hardly anything smooth. Everything has got the touch of somebody before. Plaster has hand marks that made it. So what would the implications be to the body, mind?
Well, we can hypothesize that all this multimodal quality of the environment where we live have a deep impact on the way we perceive our being in those environments, and therefore affects the quality of our life, of our daily work activity, of our daily chores at home, of the quality of our relationship with the people with whom we share those environments. The good news is that all these hypotheses can be empirically investigated, and there is still very little empirical research being done, although my feeling is that people are becoming more and more aware of the possibility that cognitive neuroscience is offering. With the help of technology, we now can exploit virtual reality, which of course is still a very poor approximation of what does it mean to physically really live within a given architectural environment, but definitely it can approximate to that experience, and therefore we can build virtual environment, characterize those different virtual environment in terms of their haptic qualities, the type of material that have been employed, the color of those material, the way the space has been arranged, and the like. We can vary all these variables and study their impact on the brain body of distinct individuals. I don't think probably we won't end up with the excellent or optimal solution for all environments and to all people, because people are different, people have different tastes. So the same color of material that may work for some people in a given specific architectural environment might not work in a different environment for different people, but we can study all these variables very proficiently, empirically, and I think the outcome of this empirical research can be useful to fuel the debate in architecture, to shape the architecture of the coming years.
So the body, what you're saying, has this transcendental reality.
Yes.
Meaning, not that everything's reduced to the body.
Of course not.
We're not talking about reduction here.
No.
We're talking about a primary basis
Yes.
of something which for centuries was considered the bottom, the junk, the dirt, matter. Matter was the bottom, spirit's at the top. But what you're saying is they're all condensed into one.
Yeah, I mean,
one reality, one continuum.
as you were speaking, I couldn't refrain from visualizing this beautiful special metaphor that you were using. The body is at the bottom, the spirit is on top. I mean, this special metaphor would make no sense at all if we would be deprived of the force of gravity. It's only because our bodily nature enabling us to experiment the force of gravity that we may come up with such an idea in a corner of the universe where there's no such a thing as the force of gravity. Up and down, top and bottom would be meaningless.
But gravity, let's say, architects, our basic work, really, not to be reductionistic, but in the most primitive sense, is housing the body.
Yes.
And celebrating the force of gravity. Because gravity's, what's keeping us all here. And without it.
Yeah, it's definitely a key element in architecture. I couldn't agree more, yes. Yeah. So I want to be clear because mine is meant to be a methodological reductionism. So my key issue is experience, the experiential dimension of human life, and in order to shed new light on the experiential dimension of human life, we use this peeping hole, which is methodological reductionism. We temporarily try to reduce the experiential level at the level of the brain and body, at the level of neurons, of the interaction between brain areas, of functional connectivity and the like. But with the idea that through this journey we have, through the brain body, we go back to the experiential level with our hands full of new results, of new notion that better help us to understand where the linguistic concept, the words that we use, as I said before, to designate those experiences come from. So there is a clear genetic role to be played by cognitive neuroscience. I sometimes describe myself as a cognitive archaeologist. So I'm up to study where all these words, concepts that are historically determined. So we need history, we need philology, we need etymology, we need aesthetic, we need philosophy, but we also need cognitive neuroscience, because cognitive neuroscience with this specific approach can help us in a better understanding of where all these concepts come from, because we can actually study the cognitive modulation, we can study the idiosyncratic way in which we employ in a given ethnocultural context those concepts and words. But the basic truth is, and is not mine, is a quote from a book I love by Primo Levi, I sommersi e I salvati, the saved and the drawn, when he says that understanding means simplifying, and in order to understand by simplifying, the human species invented incredible tools like language and thought and the use of concepts. I think this is crucial also in our conversation here, because it shows that, as I was saying before, experience is always exceeds the word that we learn to employ to theorize about that experience. It's richer. So theories are an oversimplified, incredibly powerful account of this magmatic, most of the time non-conscious, multimodal experience we are making of the world.
So, your work tells us that memory and imagination are integral to each other.
Yes. So the old idea is that memory is something like an archive made of a variety of files, and whenever we want to remember something or something comes back from memory, we retrieve that file from that drawer. This is clearly false. Memory is an active and dynamic process which is recreated in the very moment when we recollect something. This is also clearly showing why our memory quite often is so poor. We believe to remember clearly, and it can be shown that our memory is partial, imperfect, and the like. So memory and imagination are again two words that designate two apparently very distinct and different concepts, which nevertheless share a lot. In both cases, what we do is simulate something, recreating it in the very moment that we imagine it or we memorize it, we remember it. A very good friend of mine, someone I really have an incredible estimation for her work, the novel writer and essayist writer Siri Ustvedt, in one of her essays wrote that for a novel writer, writing a novel, writing about a fictional character is something like remembering something that never happened. And in this beautiful expression, I think you have all the key elements with a lot more boring words I was trying to tell you. The tightly coupled and intertwined nature of memory and imagination, they are made to a certain degree of the very same fabric. And this fabric has a lot to do with embodied simulation, in my opinion.
So, in architecture, which is static, buildings don't move. How does that affect our memory and imagination? The lack.
Well,
how is implied movement?
Well, they don't move, but we move constantly. Within those buildings, we move our eyes to explore visually those buildings or rooms or architectonical environments. We walk around to explore them from the outside, and we walk in, we sit, we lay, we stand up, we sit again, we move on escalators. So we are constantly animating those apparently static buildings with our movement. And as we said earlier on, movement is always present even when we are standing still and beholding static objects. Movement is always implied. Therefore, it is very much the same in our relation to architecture.
So movement is implied in the case of the cell phone sitting on the desk.
Yes.
We have certain associations with the cell phone. Our body unconsciously moves to pick it up, or we imagine it doing that.
Yeah, and don't forget that we constantly move our eyes to perceive that object. So even our perception, our static perception of a static object, it's also an example of the dynamic building and filling in being performed by the brain-body system, because we tend to forget about that, but about 20% of our vision time is blanks, because we move our eyes constantly, and during movement the image is not occupying the same position in the retina, but even more, we constantly blink, and while blinking it's like having the curtain covering temporarily the stage on which the film or the theatrical piece goes on. We are totally unaware of those blanks brought in by eye movements and by our closing of our eyes with the blink reflex. So we constantly fill those gaps, and we have the illusion that our perception is continuous and complete. It's never like that. Our perception is incomplete, and our perception is the active outcome of the filling in produced by the working of the neurons sitting in our brain.
And stasis is the exception rather than the rule. I mean, everything's in movement.
Yes.
Everything is dynamic.
Yeah, by all means.
Even a building which is standing still.
Yeah.
But to enter a room that's furnished has to be a completely different experience from the brain's point of view than entering one that's empty, that doesn't have any imprints of the body or any sense of invitation.
Indeed. Or when you live for some time in a very small environment, and all of a sudden you move to a bigger house, or the opposite. I mean, you feel the difference quite powerfully, and this affects the way you experience, because your perception, which has been for months or years scaled to a certain type of peripersonal space, so your navigation pattern in those smaller or bigger places have been somehow inscribed in your own implicit memories, require all of a sudden a total recalibration, because you have moved to a completely different environment, which requires novel strategies of relation in terms of movements.
So what you're saying is essentially that in living in a place and spending time in a place, we're absorbing the place into our person.
Definitely, and at the same time we make that place another way of expressing who we are. So there is a sort of symbiosis. We become a little more like the environment in which we live, but ideally the environment in which we live slowly become more and more like ourselves. So there has to be a mutual exchange, and it's a reciprocal relationship, like in all the things we affect by means of relating to them.
So key word here is relation.
Yes, if you allow me just one keyword, I would say that bodily, qualifying it as bodily relation. Yes, that's where everything comes from, in a very loose way.
I think that's a fantastic bottom line.
Thank you. Thank you for your very stimulating questions, and I would like to take this opportunity to say hello to all the people who are sitting and listening to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Vittorio.
Thank you.